2022 Conservation Commission meeting, and we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, so Sue is upstairs at another meeting, our minute taker, and she should be down, but I'll just take roll call. Juliana? Here. Chris?
Here.
Sam?
Here.
Ellen? Here. Jeff?
Present.
I'm here.
All right, Melissa? Here. All right, so only David is, I think he'll be here, and Colin is not able to be here tonight. And, okay. Any comments from the public? Don't see any from the public, and usually I don't think anybody's remote, so we'll move along. One thing I would like to do is add 2 items to the agenda, to amend the agenda. One is we want to talk about the October 15th Conservation Connections event, so I'd like to add that after land stewardship. And we also have a request to have a group event. It's actually a wedding ceremony at Heron Point Sanctuary. So I'd like to add that also about that time on the agenda, if that would be okay. Any issues with that? Okay, thank you.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's wait on the minutes, because it'd be better if Sue were here, so we'll just wait a few minutes on that. I can do the finance report. We don't actually have any changes from really probably the end of July, because it's a really busy time for the finance department, doing last year's budgets, wrapping up, and then they do an audit. So the report I sent you basically is kind of our balances from I think back in July. And as you recall, last meeting we talked about we actually have an increase in our general fund allocation for this fiscal year, which is great. And we didn't really have any major expenses for last month except the wrap-up of, I think, the Heron Point kiosk. So I think I will just provide this. Sue has this in the packet, the summaries of our accounts, so I think I'll just go with that. Any questions on the finance report? And we did submit the budget that we approved for FY24. That was submitted to Bart and Steve Fournier, the town manager, so they should be hopefully discussing that as the budget process moves ahead. Okay, so Shanda Park permit application. Recall that we got this from Jerry Collins. This is an annual permit request that he submits, and this is the same time period that he's always requested for a portion of the weir, and he pulls it up at high tide and puts it on the bank. So this is sort of the pocket, he calls it. So it seems like it's inconsistent with what he's asked for in the past. So I thought we could probably discuss or approve it tonight if you're willing. So any motion or discussion?
Nothing's changed at all?
Nothing's changed.
No?
It looks the same. I've talked to people. It sounds like it's the same as he always requested.
Okay.
So.
Then I move to approve Jerry Collins' request for the weir at Shanda Park.
Do we have a second, Chris? Okay, let me just make a note. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, 5, 6. All opposed? Nobody else was here. All right, thank you. Okay, great. Moving along. All right, so we have a guest speaker, Emma, and before we introduce and get started, we have some handouts to go with our training tonight on conservation easements, which is, that came out of there. All right, Emma's going to hand some stuff out. I'm going to hand some stuff out.
Fancy. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah, we have a couple people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
So what I'm handing out is we're doing conservation easement training, and we're going to use the Smith Sisters conservation easement that's owned by, the land is owned by New Hampshire Audubon, and we monitor the easement. So we're using that as a nice property to do training on. And, yes, actually, yes. They already have one, so you can grab one. Yeah.
So, when the easement was put in place, TNC.
Right, so yeah, we can go over that kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, this is a complicated.
Yeah, I know, this is a good
I
one.
was reading it today, I was like, whew.
Pass those, you get one of those? You get one of those?
Yeah.
Get my set a little bit.
I found a typo in the deed.
That's always interesting.
Wow. I feel very underprepared for this meeting.
All right, I'll take one of each of those too. Okay, I think, are we ready, Emma? I can introduce you and we can.
Oh, it's working, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Um,
Yeah, I'll introduce our idea again tonight. So we're having a training with Emma Tutine, who's with UNH Cooperative Extension, to really just a refresher on how to monitor conservation easements, since we hold at least 7 easements in town, and we're responsible for monitoring them or having somebody monitor them for us. So I just want to briefly go over what I handed out, and then I'll turn it over to Emma. So Bart nicely printed out, I did a little update of our townwide map, which shows the conservation easements in green. So when we discuss some easements, we are going to discuss each of them tonight. You'll know where they are. And this is the corresponding spreadsheet that describes sort of the key features of each, or the key, whatever you call those, parameters for each easement. The other thing you have is the actual conservation easement deed for this conservation easement. You have the boundary survey that goes with the property for the easement. You have a map that shows, a nice aerial map that shows some aspects of the property. You have last year's monitoring report, which David Bell has been monitoring the property, so we have an example from David's work there, which has been great. And Em and I worked on actually, what we've been doing we've been doing a great job, I think, but all of our forms are different for every property. So what we want to do is make the form consistent across all of our easements. And so we worked on we have a template that we're hoping that you all would be willing to adopt and we would use. And so you'll see at the top of that one, the monitoring report template. It's a 2-page. It actually lists the property and again, some of the key parameters of that property, and then the rest of the information,
Yeah, I don't
except
think
for
we
the.
have that one.
Oh, you don't have that one. Sorry. Oh, there are files in here. Here.
Okay. Do we need this one too?
Yeah, you should have. Did you get that one?
No.
Okay. Sorry.
Yep.
Yep.
So it's, I think I'm,
Okay, it's a little confusing. One should say 2021 at the top, which is last year's David Bell's monitoring report.
that's what I don't have,
Okay.
David Bell,
And you have the template
I
that
have a
looks blank?
template.
Okay.
which I've
Very good.
obviously labeled as David Bell did this.
Sorry, I know, it's a little confusing, but we wanted to,
Yes. You understand, right?
I have the blank, the template.
there we go. We'll get there.
Yeah, this one?
No,
All right.
no, that's,
And
yeah,
just
that's the missing
while
one.
we're still handing out, so
Thank
the
you.
point of,
I have the template, I don't have the one David Bell.
Do you have the template?
I have the template, I don't have one. All right.
there we go. Thank you,
Sorry.
Melissa. No, Mike. So the reason for providing these particular documents is, again, these are all documents that pertain to the easement we're going to talk about in detail, is that each easement that we have now has a field file. So if you're monitoring an easement, you would take the field file when you go out to monitor the easement, and it would have these materials in it. So you have everything you need. You can either, do digital monitoring, or you can just write on here, and you can write on the maps and submit that, but we'll talk about that sort of thing a little bit later. Okay, so I think everybody has things, but feel free if you have a question or something, like, hey, I don't know what we're talking about. So,
Yeah,
I'm gonna turn over to Emma again with UNH Cooperative Extension. Thank you for being here.
my pleasure. Everybody in my family was very confused that I was leaving to go to a meeting and not like going upstairs to my computer for a meeting. So I haven't done too many in-person programs yet, so it's nice to actually be here with you all. So, as Ellen said, I am going to go through this presentation that goes through the steps of how to monitor conservation easement, specifically geared towards volunteers. And so I'm going to, a little bit about what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about what a conservation easement is. Some of this might be, old news for you guys, but it's a good refresher just to have in mind as it pertains to monitoring. A little bit about why we monitor easements. We're going to talk about the parts of an easement deed, which is, easement deeds are like legal contracts, so they're kind of dense. Talk about the monitoring visit, and then looking at survey maps, what boundaries tend to look like out in the field, what you might see, how to document the visit, how you might deal with violations, and then the role of the monitor versus the role of an expert. And this is a presentation I give to usually a mixed audience of conservation commissioners, but also people who volunteer for a land trust. So I'll try to frame what I am talking about tonight for you as a conservation commissioner. So what's your role when you're out there as a monitor, but then that role changes a little bit when you come back if you think you've found a problem out there. So, and then I'll just touch on safety a little bit as well. And I would say, if you have questions as I'm going, feel free to interrupt me. And if it feels like we're taking too long, then I'll let you know and sort of rein us back in. Give me 1 second while I set up my screen a little better here. Okay, so first things first, what is a conservation easement? So the definitions sort of just up here on the screen. It's a permanent, legally binding agreement between a landowner and a land trust, conservation organization, or government agency. So in this case, we're talking about a government agency as the town holding the easement, that restricts the use of land to protect its significant natural features. And so just to explain that a little further, when you own land, you hold many different rights associated with that land, like the right to cut timber, the right to grow crops, to build a home, to subdivide the property, to extract minerals, obviously all subject to zoning and other laws. But by placing a conservation easement on a property, the landowner is voluntarily, so that's key for people to understand, it's a voluntary agreement. They voluntarily agree to give up some of those rights. And typically, those rights, include things like the right to build a house, the right to mine, so to like dig for gravel or sand, things like that. And the easement holder, so you as the town, when you hold an easement, you've taken on the permanent responsibility and the legal obligation to ensure that the easement terms are upheld. And so you're the steward of your easements. And so that's where the easement monitoring comes in. You have to go out and make sure that on the ground that the easement terms are being upheld. So that's your role as the steward of those easements. Again, interrupt me if you have questions. So that sort of leads us into why we monitor easements. So there's a legal requirement, which I just sort of alluded to. So the deed is a legal contract, so you've agreed to uphold the easement terms, and so monitoring is the way that you do that. And then a slightly more complicated piece of that is that if any if any part of the easement value was donated by the landowner and they benefited, they received tax benefits as a result of that donation, the IRS regulations require that the easement holder must have a commitment to protect the conservation purposes of the donation And regular monitoring is what demonstrates that commitment. So, so again, that's like a little complicated and probably doesn't pertain to all of your easements, but basically it goes beyond just the legal contract. If the original landowner who donated or sold the easement received any tax benefit from that, then the IRS is also involved, and they want to know that those easements are getting monitored. And so then beyond the legal responsibilities, there's also an ethical and professional responsibility. The easement holder has agreed to help care for this land forever, so it's important to uphold that end of the agreement. And then this doesn't pertain to towns specifically, but the Land Trust Alliance, which is the national organization that accredits land trusts across the country, they have a set of standards and practices that we actually encourage towns to take a look at, because they're great practices. It's sort of like the best practices for land conservation. And so they are included in their standards and practices, so that's sort of their big document of best practices, is that you monitor every year your easements. So it's just professionally considered best practice. And then finally, another, and I think maybe one of the most important reasons for monitoring, is that it provides an opportunity to nurture the relationship you have with the landowner. This property is a little different because the landowner is another conservation, it's a conservation organization, so we're maybe a little less worried about what they're gonna do on the property over time, or maintaining that relationship is even easier maybe with the conservation organization. But if it's an individual landowner, you want to think of monitoring not so much as like a compliance inspection, like you're not going out there to like be the like conservation police. You're really wanting to help the landowner build that relationship with them over time, so that they're more likely to call you and ask you questions before they do something on the land, so that they're more likely to call you up and say, hey, we're selling the property, and when that happens. So things like that. You just want to think of monitoring as just another way to build on that relationship and have a touch point with that landowner year after year. So I think sometimes when we get talking about like all the nitty-gritty of the legal aspects of an easement, you can kind of get into that mindset of, or at least I do, of like, oh, you're going out there to like make sure everything's a-okay, and that is part of your role, but I think what really happens in most years is it's a great opportunity to get out, connect with the landowner, see what's going on, and just build that over time. All right, so I've alluded to the easement terms, that you are responsible for making sure that the terms of the easement are upheld. So how do you know what the easement terms are? So they're all written out in the easement deed. And so this scary looking document is the easement deed, and we have the one for all the pictures and everything I'm going to refer to for the most part tonight are from this easement, so that way you're looking at something that actually pertains to the town of Newmarket. And as I alluded to, this is a legal contract, and it's written about the way you'd expect a legal contract to be written. It's very dense. It's using a lot of like legal language that's not the everyday language we're used to hearing, even as it pertains to conservation. So the first time you pick up a deed, at least I found like the first few times I picked up a deed and it was hard to even break through what was there and learn how to interpret what it was saying. But once you take your time and work through and sort of understand what the different parts of the easement are, and you understand what parts of the deed really apply to monitoring, it is really an important tool, at least every few years, to go back to the deed and make sure you understand what you're looking for when you're out on the land. Again, the purpose of monitoring is making sure that this contract is being upheld, so you want to make sure that you understand what the terms of the contract are. So I'm going to go through just, and just a note about language. There's, again, a lot of like legal jargon in the deed, and so learning to interpret that is helpful. And so one thing that I find gets kind of confusing is the term grantor and grantee. So the grantor is the one granting the easement to the grantee. So the landowner is the grantor, and in this case, the town is the grantee. When this deed was written, the landowner was the Nature Conservancy. Now it's New Hampshire Audubon, but so just keep that in mind. So where it says the Nature Conservancy, just sort of replace with New Hampshire Audubon in your mind. So I'm going to talk about the parts of the deed, sort of more generally. This deed has some unique parts, which I'll talk about, but any deed that you pick up will have sort of similar sections that are really relevant to monitoring. So the first is the purposes of the easement. So, this first page, it's helpful to read through that. It sort of gives you like who the property was given to, by who, when. But you can kind of skip ahead. If you're really just trying to understand what you need to know for monitoring, the first section that's really important is the purposes. And so the purposes are pretty much what it sounds like. It lays out the reasons that this easement was put in place. So it explains what the easement is protecting. So it could include, in this case, water quality. In this easement, water quality is a big part of it. Wildlife habitat, it could be scenic enjoyment, recreation, forestry and agriculture. And important to note again, I just alluded to this, but every property is different, and so every easement deed is different. So just keep that in mind, that you really do want to review the deed for each property, because they do have different purposes and then different rights. So just keep that in mind. Great. So then the next section that again most easements will have, and this is where, let me just make sure. Yeah, so section 2, which is on page 3, towards the bottom, it's called use limitations. And you can follow along in the deed you have in front of you if you want. So again, this is sort of what it sounds like. These are the limitations to what the landowner can do on the property. And they usually generally include things like commercial activities, subdivision, which I'll make a comment about this one in a moment, but structures, buildings, mining, altering soils, disposing of waste, putting up billboards, putting up cell towers, things like that. So this really lays out what the landowner is basically not allowed to do, but then it also includes some exceptions. So this is where it starts to lay out things like, so for example, and this usually comes pretty high up in the use limitations. So, it says under A, the property shall be maintained in perpetuity as open space without there being conducted any residential development activities, industrial or commercial, except forestry and agriculture, including timber harvesting, such as described in section 3. So then it gives sort of a brief definition of what they mean by forestry, agriculture, and wildlife habitat management, which are 3 uses that are exceptions to that use limitation. Then in section 3, it'll go into way more detail about what the landowner can do within those reserved rights. One interesting thing about this property, and I don't remember exactly where it came up, so excuse me for that, but so I mentioned subdivision, which is a very common use limitation in easements. In this property, if I understood correctly, there is actually a reserved right to subdivide the property as it relates to the town using it as a water source. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I think it, because this was water supply,
Yeah.
State water supply land, so it's not, it doesn't allow the town to automatically drill a
Yeah.
well, but if the landowner, it was more about extracting water rather than drilling a well. And because this property actually crosses into Durham, so there's 2 towns, so if you did that, they would probably subdivide,
Yeah,
the likelihood of that ever happening is probably zero.
yeah,
But that was included at the time of the
Yeah.
easement because it was water supply grant money. Because Fallets Brook, which this incorporates, was historically a water supply for the town,
oh,
but is no longer.
yeah, okay. But I guess, to me, that was just a really good example of like, so, you know, in here I have like, oh, subdivision is generally a use limitation, but again, every easement is different, and that's where reading this would give you that information. Again, maybe not super relevant to monitoring, because you wouldn't necessarily, that's not something you would stumble upon when you're monitoring, but just again to the point that these easements are all quite different, and they allow some things and don't allow other things, so just keep that in mind. So another thing that's kind of different about this easement is that there's a separate section for stewardship planning, which is, I think, not typical. Often, a lot of the information that's included in this section would be found under the reserved rights, which is the next section I have up here. So I'll talk quickly about reserved rights, and then I'll talk about this stewardship planning section, and Ellen, feel free to jump in. But, so the next section, do you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Is the stuff about the water source like deeper into it, just because the deeds shall not be subdivided, just leave it at that, or I
Yeah.
guess ownership would stay the same?
So if you go, so the reserved rights
Yeah.
section, which is the section I have listed up here, is where it goes into more detail about what the landowner's rights are. So the use limitations are sort of about what they can't do, and the reserved rights are about what they can still do. And so if you look at, I think it's in section A of, I never know how to, but so section 4 on page 9 is the reserved rights. And under section 4, part A, it talks about drinking water facilities and I'm not gonna like pull it out quickly, but somewhere in here it said, part B, the grant on page 10, the grantor reserves the right to subdivide the property into separately conveyable lots only as necessary for the grantor's exercise of the reserved rights in section 4A above, which all have to do with the water extraction. So it was just, that's pretty unique. That's not something you would see in most easements. So just something to, I just wanted to point that out in terms of like, oh, every easement is different. So the reserved rights typically include things like agriculture, forestry, non-commercial recreation, education, what you can build. So sometimes you could build like a farm stand or a sugar house, or a structure for any kind of agricultural structure, or even sometimes structures relating to non-commercial recreation, like a warming hut. That was, sort of the focus of the property. And then in most easements, included in that description of the reserved rights, so it would say like, well, you can harvest timber, but, and then it would explain, in most cases, in an easement, it explains that you do need to have a management plan before you harvest timber, and that management plan, you should share that management plan with the easement holder. In this easement deed, the stewardship plan, all that information about stewardship planning is pulled out into its own section, which is interesting, and I think just probably points to, I would guess, Ellen, maybe you know, but to the fact that the landowner in this case is a conservation organization with a really strong focus in stewardship planning, and that this property really has a lot of wildlife value, and so I suspect it has a little bit to do with that. But,
Yeah, I don't recall specifically why they
Yeah.
did it that way, but it's probably the reason.
yeah. So any other questions about that? Does that make sense? So the use limitations are what the landowner can't do, and the reserved rights are what they can continue to do. But it goes into a fair bit of detail, again, about like, you could do forestry, but these are sort of the terms under which you can do it. And so you can start to understand why, before you go out to monitor a property, knowing that is going to help inform what you are looking for when you're out there, to know if there's a violation, to know if something is, if it's not upholding the terms of the easement or the purposes of the easement.
Emma, were you going to talk about it later, or sometimes things are not outright prohibited in an easement because then it gets really hard to enforce? Can you just touch on that before you were going? Like, you wouldn't say no motorized vehicles. You might not say no motorized vehicles because then the monitor somebody has to enforce that. And that's a really hard thing to enforce. So you can say something like, the landowner can prohibit motorized vehicles. So they can, but it's not a requirement. You see how the difference is? Because if it specifically said no motorized vehicles, then let's say we as the monitors would have to constantly enforce that, which is almost impossible. So you leave it up to the landowner to decide. If they want to do it, that's fine. But it's not really in the easement something that we would have to enforce. Is that right? Is that a good interpretation of that concept?
Yeah. Yes. I would say also, unfortunately, especially with older easements, sometimes they are really specific, and that can be problematic because something that maybe really shouldn't be a violation ends up being a violation sort of as a technicality, or it's just not very like forward thinking in terms of like what somebody might do with this property, you know, like solar panels. The easements written, 20 years ago people weren't thinking about, hey, somebody might want to put solar panels on their property. And so it doesn't say yes or no, and so then people who hold easements, whether it's land trusts or towns, are sort of forced with having to figure out, like, well, does that uphold the purposes of the easement or not? And that's still sort of a question of debate, but so it can be complicated, especially with older easements. I find newer easements, tend to be a little more like leave a little more flexibility, or are written in such a way that there's some decisions up to the landowner, so it doesn't put the burden of enforcement on the easement holder. So
just the other area that I always find I think is really important. There's always in the use limitations, like on this one, it's page 5, the talk about the issue about structures. Like that's always a really big, like what's a structure, and can you build a shed? Can you build a barn? Can you build this or that? And often it lists a lot of things you can't do, like a tennis court or swimming pool. That's always there. But then there might be something else that's not listed there, and then you kind of have to go back and forth. Because I think agricultural structures are always kind of a big one that people want to do.
And things you might not think of, and if you look at on page 5, like it lists quite a few, like an unpaved road, a dam, which I wouldn't necessarily think of as, but a gate, a fence, a bridge, a culvert, or wildlife nest structure. Those are all things that somebody could put on the property. So it is, I think that is a key piece to look at ahead of time. But then also, I've monitored an easement and seen something, and then like made a note of it, but then went back and checked the deed to see like, oh, is that allowed or not? So you can also, it doesn't, you don't need to memorize this before you go out in the field either. But there are some. The structures one I think is key, because that's probably one of the most likely things you might stumble upon on a property. All right, so the next section of most deeds is and again, the order of these sometimes gets a little different once you get past the reserved rights. So in this deed, they have the notification of transfer taxes and maintenance and benefits and burdens, and then affirmative rights of the grantee. I would say the taxes and the benefits and burdens do pertain a little bit to monitoring. It just basically says that the easement's going to stay with the property forever, but sometimes there's like a little more information included in there about access. But the affirmative rights of the grantee, those are your rights as the easement holder, and this is where it says that you basically have the right to monitor the property annually. Well, it doesn't say annually, but just the right to monitor it. And that you have the right to post the boundary, that you can put signs indicating that you hold the easement around the boundary of the property.
All easement signs that we have here. This
Nice.
It's easement this time.
Looks like a little pub coaster.
What's that?
Looks like a little pub coaster.
And so that's another section that's important for you to look at. Sometimes it includes things like the ability to do educational work, to conduct wildlife studies. Sometimes there's restrictions about where you can post boundary signs. So I've seen an easement where the holder could post signs everywhere except around the exclusion area. Like the people didn't want to look out their house and see like little land trust conservation easement boundary signs out their window. So fair enough. So, you know, that's where it's important to like just take note of what your rights are as the grantee to access the property. So then there's the rest of the sections of the easement deed are we sort of generally refer to as the administrative provisions. So they do include information about like property tax, so like who's responsible for paying the property tax, subsequent transfer, dispute resolution, so breach of easement. So there is some information in the deed about what happens if there is a breach of easement. So it's worth looking through that, but it's not necessarily relevant to the actual monitoring visit. That's maybe more relevant if you find a violation on the property. All right. Any questions about the deed itself? Hopefully that kind of helps break things down a little bit and to understand like what parts you'd be looking at before you go out to monitor. All right, so now I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about like how to prepare for a visit on a property and then what to do when you get out there. And again, just like interrupt me with questions as we go. All right, Ellen alluded to a field file, and so the first thing to do before you go out to monitor an easement is to get the field file from, I assume they live here at Town Hall. And so those generally include, do you have the baseline documentation report in there?
If there is one for the property, and this one
Okay.
Does have one.
Okay. So in this presentation, I don't really talk about that document, but I'll mention it now. So the baseline documentation report is a very detailed report that
Pictures.
is like an account of what the property looked like on the day the easement was put in, or whatever, the month or a few months right around when the easement was put in place. So when the property was protected. So it's giving you a baseline against which to compare, future changes. It's a lot of information, so I don't think it's necessarily something you need to review every single year. If it's a property you've never been on, I would definitely say it's worth looking through that document. And or every few years just to refresh your memory. But that is, again, it's important because, so for example, I've monitored an easement for Southeast Land Trust where there were these like metal drums in the woods that look like the toxic waste metal drums. And I had never been on the property and I was like, did somebody dump these here? Have these always been here? And had I seen the baseline documentation report, I didn't have access to it, but turns out they were there. They're empty. They weren't a concern. But that's where if I had known that ahead of time, I could have just like scooted on by. But it wasn't hard to figure that out after the fact either.
What would happen in that, is that something that we would be able to say, these need to be removed?
I'll get to that later. Yeah, good question. We'll talk about violations. Yeah, if they were there and they're not a problem and they weren't asked to be removed at the time the easement was put in place, no. But if it turns out they are a violation in some way, then yes, you would be asking the landowner to remove them. But I'll talk a little bit more about how you get to that point. So also in that file should be previous monitoring reports. Those are really helpful to review. Even if you were the one monitoring the property the year before, I personally, maybe I have a bad memory, but I don't, I can kind of remember the visit, but I often have found it's really helpful to reference those because, you find a down tree along the boundary line, you're like, was this here last year? I don't remember. Or even like which direction you walked the boundary, did you go clockwise or counterclockwise, that kind of stuff can help you figure out what you're gonna do this year. So yeah, so that's the kind of things you'd be looking in that previous monitoring report too, was like if there were any notes about something that had changed, or again, looking at the map of where you or somebody else went, it might determine where you go visit this year, whether you do the same path or something different. And I'll talk a little bit about how you decide where to go in the next slide. So planning your route. So what the places you want to focus on visiting when you're monitoring the easement are areas of high conservation value, and that could be determined in a couple of different ways. One is by reading the easement deed, and again, like what is the purpose of this easement? And in this case, you know, some of the things that jumped out at me were like water quality, wildlife habitat, and so those maybe then looking at a map of the property are the places I'm going to focus on, are like the wet areas, and you know, the fields and the gravel pit, because I know those are the places that are offering the most conservation value. And so if there was a violation in one of those places, it would certainly be against the purposes of the easement. So, so that's one place to focus. Another are places where violations are most likely to happen. So, for example, like anywhere, if a trail comes from another property onto the property, through the property. Trails in general are often places where violations can happen along the boundary line, anywhere along the boundary line, but especially if, you know, if property backs up to a neighborhood and there's like multiple landowners, those are all places where violations are most likely to happen. And then any features or issues noted in previous reports, again, may determine where you decide to go when you visit the property. And so then to actually plan your route, I recommend looking at a couple different maps, which Ellen has provided to us, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about how to, a little bit more in detail about how to read a survey map. They can also be kind of hard to interpret. But so this is the survey map for the Smith Sisters property up on the screen here, and you can see it's huge, so on the screen it's tiny. But if you were going out to the property, this doesn't actually give you a lot of information about what you're going to encounter on the ground. Like the map is all white, right? So you don't know where there's water, there's a little bit about water, but where there's fields or forests or the gravel pit. What this does give you is the boundary lines, which again, we know that may be a place that has a likelihood of being where a violation occurs. It also shows you where the exclusion area is, and we didn't talk about that, and in this property there isn't technically, it's not technically the exclusion anymore, right? It's a separate property. But in most easements, there's an area, you know, around a house that is excluded from the easement but is still part of the property. In this case, again, it's not part of the property anymore, but you can see where that boundary line is around that house. And again, that's probably a place you would want to look, because that's more likely a place to be where there might be a violation. The next map you might want to look at is an aerial photo map. And this obviously is going to give you a lot more information about like what's actually on the ground besides the boundaries. So it gives you a sense of where the fields are, where the wetlands are, and you know, that maybe takes some practice of interpreting aerial photos, but I feel like with Google Maps these days, most people have some sense of like what a field looks like versus the forest. In this case, the wetlands are sort of drawn out as well, which is nice. So, you know, the nice thing about the Smith Sisters property is it's big, but it's not so big that you couldn't walk the boundary in one visit, I would guess. And you might even have time, depending on how much time you have, you might even have time to walk some of the trails on the interior of the property. And so where you go is also going to be dictated by how much time you have and how big the property is. So on a really small property, if you can walk the boundary and some of the trails and check out, you know, the wet areas and do it all, that's great. If you can't do that every year, that's okay. Maybe one year you just walk the boundary line, but then the next year you go in and walk the trails on the interior of the property, and then you sort of alternate like that. I don't think any of Newmarket's easements are so big, but if the easement is really big too, sometimes you can't even do the whole boundary in 1 year, so then you're like really dividing the property up each year. So you don't have to look at the entire property every year. You just want to make sure that maybe over every 2 or 3 years you're covering everything, and maybe making a point if there's something noted in a previous visit, you would want to at least try to visit those spots again. Oh, and I forgot, sorry, the topo map, I would say in this part of the state is not super relevant because we're relatively flat here, but it is helpful to get a sense. I don't have the parcel data on here, but this is where the Smith Sisters property is, and you get a sense, I mean, interestingly, like the gravel pit doesn't really show up on here because it's not that fine detail, but you know, the property is relatively flat. But if you were going to a different property that you weren't familiar with, it might give you a sense of what the terrain would be like. And from a safety perspective, that can be helpful for sure. Like, is it going to be really steep? Oh, that also might give you an indication of like how much you can get done in a day too. So those are the survey map and the aerial photo are the most important maps to look at when you're planning your route. If you want to have access to a topo map, that can also be helpful. Any questions about?
Just a note on this particular property, too bad David's not here because David Bell's the one who's been monitoring this. But you see there's a little leg out to Wildey Falls Road, so there's no parking access. That's only a walking 50-foot right-of-way, and so you have to park either alongside the road or you could park down at the Audubon's property, which is a couple properties east. So, and David, I think, lives next door, so he is able to walk.
Oh, that's convenient.
That works nicely.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually knowing, that might be something, I mean, to include in, I don't know if that's included in the, I guess it would be included in the baseline report maybe. That kind of information about, or actually maybe it's included in the previous years, but how to access the property.
Yeah, good idea.
I think especially for towns where there's can be a fair bit of turnover in conservation commissions, and you know, that way if somebody picks up the folder and they've never monitored it before, they know, you know, how to get there. And that can be, this property is a little different because the house is no longer part of the property, and so the landowner doesn't live there. The landowner is New Hampshire Audubon, so it's a little different. But so normally you might park in their driveway or something like that, but yeah, this property definitely has unique access. All right, so the next step in planning for your visit is to contact the landowner. Again, in this case, it's a little different with a conservation organization as the landowner. I don't know if, does David or do you contact them every year? But
I don't know if he has been.
Yeah, it might not be a bad idea every once in a while. I feel like they probably just sort of, you know, assume you're monitoring. They might check in with you every so often. But generally, again, this isn't like the traditional agreement or easement where it's a private, you know, a landowner, an individual person. So I think it's more important when it's an individual person, you want to reach out to that landowner before you go out to the property. Obviously, you're going to be on their property. So you want to sort of give them notice, and that, you know, hopefully you have some relationship with that landowner already, whether that's giving them a phone call, sending them an email, inviting them to join you on the walk, asking them if you can park in their driveway. But when you do talk to them, hopefully you have a chance to ask them some questions. Most landowners, or at least my experience has been, most landowners don't tend to join you on the walk. I know some do, but so if you get a chance to talk to them ahead of time and ask, like, has anything changed over the past year? Have you noticed anything different? Has anything changed on any abutting properties? And then you can, you know, again, like, engage them. This is your opportunity to connect with them and build that relationship. So you can also say, like, have you seen any cool wildlife on the property this year? Have you been getting out there a lot? How's it going? You know, just like you would build any relationship over time. That's your opportunity to connect with them. And I usually try, if you, again, like if you do have the right to go on the property, so I do try, if you aren't hearing back from the landowner, so usually like the initial contact is like, hey, I'm going out there, you know, and you're kind of expecting a response, ask some questions. If you don't get a response, you might say like, oh, I haven't heard from you. I'm planning to be there on this date in the morning. You know, please be aware that we'll be on the property. Just to say that like you don't actually need them to give you their permission to go on the property, and you need to monitor. So you can, you know, make it more clear that you're going to go on a specific date, and that way at least you've sort of covered your bases in terms of letting them know, and you can still monitor. But most of the time people are pretty responsive, at least that's been my experience. All right. Any questions about the like planning and lead up to getting out there?
Just
Yeah.
in terms of the template, we did add that because I think it was missing from some of the monitoring reports in the past. So we did add the very beginning. Did you review the easement deed? Did you look at last year's report? Did you contact the landowner, the land manager? Did you meet them? So we've added that just as a pretty easy check off. And you can include the people that were with you on the walk and obviously the date and time, so forth.
Yeah, and that's a helpful checklist. I don't, expect you to remember everything I'm throwing at you tonight, which I should also say, like I forgot to mention at the beginning, what's in this folder is written out most of what I'm sharing with you tonight in this How to Monitor Conservation Easements guide. And then there's also an outdoor skills guide, which talks a little bit more than I'm going to about how to read survey maps, but also how to use a map and compass in the field and things like that, and a little bit about safety. So those are good things to reference later. So things to bring with you in the field. A clipboard, I like to actually take notes when I'm in the field. So clipboard, the field form that Ellen shared with you, the maps, a cell phone, just as a safety point. But also for most people, your cell phone is your camera, and part of documenting the visit, which I'll talk about in a minute, is taking photos as well. I do recommend bringing a compass, and hopefully you know how to use one well enough to use it to get out of the woods if you have to. But it is pretty helpful for following the boundary lines as well, using the compass. Flagging, easement boundary signs, if you're gonna put them up anywhere, a pen and pencil, layers, water, snack, you know, sort of all the typical things you would normally bring with you in the woods. And so then the actual monitoring visit is pretty straightforward because you've done a lot of planning. You're just gonna go out there, meet with the landowner if they're gonna be joining you or not, and then, you know, follow your plan. Go out there and walk the property. And so next I'm gonna talk about survey maps, and then I'll talk about then how you document that visit as you go. All right, so again, survey maps are, they can be a lot. There's a lot of information on these maps, and they're very helpful tools, but they're hard to interpret if you've never read one before. So a little bit about the parts of a survey map. And again, I'm not gonna like get in an hour. I can't get into too much detail about this, but I know Ellen can probably help folks a bit, and I'm also happy to help in the field in the future if that's helpful. So every survey map should have like a stamp from the licensed surveyor who drew up the map and or at least approved it, and has all the relevant signatures. So it tells you a little bit about when the map also was signed. Then, so again, other parts of the map that are particularly important to familiarize yourself with is the legend. So the symbols on a survey map are pretty unique. They're different than most of the maps you're used to looking at because it's showing very different information. But they're generally standard across most survey maps, so it's helpful to get to know these. So there's all different sorts of symbols that indicate different types of boundary markers. And then I also have a set of photos that show what those boundary markers look like in the field. So we'll get to that in a moment. But so things like a drill hole, which is a drilled hole in a rock, an iron pipe, barbed wire found on the ground, a fence post, rebar, which is just also another type of like metal bar, like a rod that's hammered into the ground, a granite bound, so that's a piece of granite, like a granite post marking a boundary line, a cemetery, a hydrant, a test pit, a tree stump, a coniferous tree, so sometimes trees are actually boundary markers, a deciduous tree. I hadn't actually seen those like two different symbols for distinguishing the two trees, so that's kind of interesting. A wet area. There's also a lot of really unique abbreviations in survey maps that you learn to start to interpret, and in that training guide, actually the outdoor skills guide, I have a list of those abbreviations because they're not always included here in the legend. So things like DHF means drill hole found, but you'll also often see things like drill hole set, which means that the surveyor who drew this map set that drill hole versus finding a drill hole that somebody else put there. So, and that often is the case. That's what they mean by set versus found. They either found something that a previous surveyor put in place, or they set it themselves, which means like they hammered that iron pipe into the ground, or they drilled the hole, or so that's just can be helpful to know in terms of how new or old the boundary mark is. Also included up here, I have the north arrow, and just of note is that most survey maps are drawn to magnetic north, which is different than most of our other maps are drawn to true north. So that's just important to know when you're using a compass out in the field. It actually can make things a bit easier because your compass points to magnetic north. So it can make things a little simpler, but it's just important to know, because if you're used to adjusting the declination, in this case, you do not want to do that. Also included on the survey map, which can or cannot be useful depending on how much information you need, are the notes section. And this just gives a lot of detail about like how the surveyor, determined different boundaries and things like that. So so for example, like number 12 here is where it has something about the cemetery, how the cemetery was conveyed in the past. And then in a couple slides, I'll show you, they reference that note on the map. So as you're reading through the map and looking at information, it might reference these notes. But then these notes also, again, if you have a question about like how the surveyor figured out where that boundary line is, this is sort of like their works cited, like their references section. This is so that they keep all that in the notes section. I generally don't find I need to refer to this very often, to the notes, but just so you know what it is. The scale bar just gives you the scale of the map, but I like to show this because, again, something that's a little different about survey maps is the scale bar. The 0 is not on the left side, so the 0 is like the next point over. So just, if you thought that the whole scale bar was 400 feet, it's actually 500 feet. So just keep that in mind. Does that make sense to folks? Okay. And that's pretty consistent across most survey maps. Most survey maps will have what's called a locus map, which shows the location of the property sort of in a zoomed out view. So here you can see that little star where it says site is the property on Wadley Falls Road. Here is that, so here I've just pulled out like a couple little snippets along the boundary line to show you like some of the details that tend to be included in these maps. So on the legend, we saw that the cross represented a cemetery. So you can see here there's like a cemetery bounded by stone walls. And there's on the left-hand side, you can see there's an arrow and it says see note number 12 and detail C. So that's what I was talking about, where it references the note. And then there's a detailed, like zoomed in view of that cemetery. And I should sort of back up for a second. So one of the primary things that the survey map shows us is the bearings. So, and that's what the numbers, so if you look on the one on the left, at the bottom it says north, and I can't quite read the number from here, but 845.16 east. And then the number below that is the distance from those 2 points that you see. So that gives you the bearing, so the direction that you should walk to follow that boundary line, and the distance between the different boundary markers. So that is really helpful information. If this, and in this case, I believe the Smith Sisters property is nearly entirely bound by stone walls. So, yeah, so it's probably, you'll have an easier time following this boundary, but on some properties that's not the case, and you may have to go long stretches just following a bearing without much else to refer to. So it can be pretty important. Well, it's important to understand what those numbers mean when you're in the field, and understanding how that translates to your compass and using it in the field. And again, like I said, I'd be happy to work with Ellen to set up a time in the field if that's something folks are interested in, to show you how to do that. So then the details, a lot of survey maps will have little zoomed in sections where, in order to provide all that detailed information, they need to like kind of zoom in to that section. Here's just a few more examples of boundary lines with the bearings, and you'll also see those abbreviations I referred to earlier, like drill hole found, DHF, or like on the one in the middle says steel stake found up 4 inches with cap. So that's the boundary marker that's at that point. So when you're in the field, you'll want to be looking for those boundary markers. Again, on a property that's as well marked as this, it's a little less important, but on a property that has fewer boundary markers, it's just what's going to help you know that you're on the boundary. And over time, some of those boundary markers can get hard to find or degraded, and you'd want to make note of that as well.
Like a 12-inch hemlock.
Yeah, like a 12-inch hemlock with barbed wire is not going to be there forever, and that's often the case. So it's more problematic when it's the big tree is like a corner boundary marker, but yeah. I also wanted to mention, so on the segment that's on the right-hand side there, you'll see that instead of bearing numbers there, it just refers to, it says L21, L22, L23, L24. So again, this property has a lot of boundary markers, so these little segments are quite small, and so there's, on the survey map is also this line table or bearings table that references every bearing that they can't fit on the map. So those like L21, L22, L23, you could find all those bearings and distances in this table. So that's what that means. And then again, just to pull up like another sort of complicated part of the survey map, this is the part of the boundary that goes around that house, and includes, it's kind of hard to tell, but on the right-hand side, you'll see, you can see where that like leg is that Ellen referred to between a boundary line and the stone wall. So, you know, looking at these sort of more detailed parts can be helpful, because again, this is where you're most likely to find violations around other houses and things like that, and abutters. So just taking a close look at those can be helpful, and making sure that those boundaries are well marked when you're out on the ground. Does that make sense? All right. So other things, what you're gonna actually like see in the field for boundary markers, there's a lot of variation across properties and across surveyors, and depending how long ago the property was marked or surveyed. So here you can see some examples of sort of a traditional boundary mark that's not a permanent mark, but is, you find these quite a bit, is the surveyor will like cut the bark of the tree and paint it. And even when the tree heals, like you can see on the left, and the paint fades, there's still some evidence of that having been done. But but often, hopefully they've been painted every so often to stay visible. Some people do some weird, sort of strange creative markings on trees, but this is another example of a boundary marker we found on an easement. This is what the rebar looks like in the field. It's not always spray painted hot pink and well flagged to find. If it doesn't have any flagging on it, rebar is rust colored, so it can be very hard to see in the woods. So just something to keep in mind. But and if you find those, if you spend the time to find a boundary marker that was really hard to find, definitely use that flagging to mark it so that next year you or whoever's monitoring next can find that boundary marker easily. Especially, again, on Smith Sisters, I think that's less important because the boundary is presumably pretty easy to follow, but in places where it may not be, that becomes more important. So here's a good example of you can get a sense of how well that rebar can start to blend in with a, woodland floor. Everything's brown. There's just another example of rebar. You can barely see underneath all that undergrowth, right in the middle of the photo towards the bottom. There's like a pink cap on a piece of rebar, but somebody has very thoroughly marked the trees above as witness trees to that boundary mark. So I think it's a corner in that case. So just another example of the kinds of things you might see. Here you can see this is a cement bound, so it's just like a little post, small short post made of cement on the right. I'm actually not sure what, I think on the left there is, believe it or not, a piece of rebar in there, in those leaves. Yeah. Barbed wire is often mentioned in the survey maps as a historic boundary marker, so looking for evidence of barbed wire can be helpful if you're not sure if you're on the boundary. Here's another example of it growing through the tree. Drill holes, so to give you an idea of how hard they can be to spot, you can see in on the left, the bigger photo, it's just that little black dot on the top of the rock, and then you can see on the right where somebody's put their pen in it. Here's what it looks like up close. Some people will paint them so they're easier to see, but leaves leaves collect on top of stone walls, so they can get covered up pretty easily. Stone walls are often the only thing you have to go by on a boundary. Here's an example of a granite bound. Another granite bound that is no longer standing. So again, the kinds of things you might be looking for when you're out there. Old fence posts. Here's that corner boundary tree that is no longer a tree. So this is, where you may want to set anew, and somebody had set a rebar on the other side of this tree. But so, just things to keep in mind. And then, the easement boundary signs, you may, need to replace those every so often. This is an example of, I'm guessing, though it may have been installed a very long time ago, but of how not to install the easement sign. You wouldn't generally, I don't know if, Ellen, if you want, we can talk about this later, but you don't want to hammer the nail all the way into the tree. You leave some space and the tree, because the tree will actually grow out, and then it'll start to look like this. And if you hammer the nail all the way in, it starts to look like this much quicker, where the nail's getting kind of pushed into the sign. And here's an example of a sign that should probably be replaced. The squirrels have been eating the paint off these signs, which is pretty common, or the mice. I'm actually not sure if it's squirrels or mice that do that, but you see that quite a bit on those metal signs for whatever reason. All right, any questions about survey maps? It's kind of hard to, again, really show how to read a survey map without going out and using one in the field, but hopefully you'll have the opportunity to either do that with somebody who's done it before, or on a property where the boundary maybe is not so hard to follow, or again, like I said, I'd be happy to come come help sometime if that's something folks are interested in.
Just on this one specifically, again, David's not here and he's the one been doing it, but even at this scale, it's really hard to read details, but this is where you might draw your route or put notes. But the reason it's like this is there's 3 sheets for this survey, by DSET survey, which is an awesome survey. But so you might need all 3 sheets just to be able to see that kind of detail, but
Yeah.
mark up the one pager because it's easier then to know where you are. The other thing is, these are all gonna be available digitally, so if you are doing an easement, I'll provide all the digital documents, so if you have it on your phone, if you have that capability, you can obviously blow up the survey and use that while you're also using the hard copy.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Ellen, because this survey map, so the actual like survey map, the survey is, huge, and so when you print it at this scale, it's very hard to interpret. But then those 3 separate pages, that's actually what I use to pull all of those images from and look more closely at the survey map, and those are really easy to read and interpret. So, yeah, you definitely want to look at the more detailed maps if you need to. Yeah, like you can't read the bearings on that table here, but.
Silly question, but
Yeah.
is there any kind of color coding with the flagging?
I think some of that is maybe depends on what the towns, if they have any standard, but,
We have a surveyor,
Oh.
he works for DSET survey, or owns DSET
Oh.
survey.
It's typically, boundaries are typically flagged in orange, but some firms, as you saw, use a mix of pink and blue or orange and blue. But
Yeah,
orange is typical for a property boundary.
But it doesn't mean one thing or another, like north.
There's not a survey standard across all. Typically, like you'll tie, if there's a monument on the ground and you're trying to flag a tree near it, you'll tie the knot facing it so
Yeah.
that you see the knot pointing towards it. When sometimes people will actually tie a flag around a rock and place it on a small rock and put it on top of a drill hole, so that, if you see a big rock and you're looking for a drill hole on it, there's a small rock on it, lift that little rock up.
Huh.
Wow.
But, and often orange paint is used in drill holes, but like I said, there's no industry standard necessarily. It's just,
and I see the tree boundary paint typically is red, that's,
I think, in my experience, that's been at the request of the
Land-
conservation group or the
Okay.
landowner. I know
But then I know
Southeast
the
Land
state
Trust
uses
red and state uses blue.
to blue, yeah, so there's no, like, set standard, I guess is the
Yeah,
short answer.
Unfortunately.
But,
But one thing about that, like, I think we can we can carry the orange flagging and wrap it around, but we can't create monuments, right? So we can't
Right.
repaint, plus we're walking somebody else's property, right? So I think, wouldn't we talk to the landowner, is it okay if we
Yeah.
re-spray your drill holes, or, we wouldn't paint their trees, I think that would be something they would probably do.
I have gotten conflicting information on the painting the trees question. My understanding is that I used to think that only a surveyor could do that, but I've been told that the landowner can do that, but, I don't know.
Repaint
But,
it.
but I would say from the easement holder's perspective, you definitely would not want to be painting boundary markers without talking to the landowner and probably to a surveyor first, but, yeah,
Yeah.
but,
Blazes, Mark, I would say that blazes in trees can be confusing sometimes. And sometimes a scar in a tree can look a lot like a blaze. And,
Yeah.
and if you're off course, it can create confusion to paint the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And kind
Yeah.
of create unintended consequences down the
I
road.
like stone walls.
yes,
Stone walls are
the
bad
stone
either.
walls are perfect. But yeah, and again, like painting the tree is different than putting the easement sign. You do have the right to put those up. It's one of your affirmed rights in the deed. So, and those aren't an official like boundary marker. So, and I should mention too, you want to put those like facing out from the property, so that when somebody's coming onto the property, they see that it's a conserved property. So hopefully they are, like, oh, something different here, and maybe I need, need to pay attention. But. All right. Great. Well, I'm glad you have somebody on the commission who can answer way more detailed questions than I can about survey maps. Hopefully I mostly got things right. So,
Nice work.
Yeah, thanks. All right, so documenting the visit. So Ellen mentioned, so we have, and what's showing here is like we have a sample template that folks can use, because most towns, like Ellen said, like don't have a standard form. And so we being Extension, we're hoping to help standardize a little bit like the information towns are collecting when they're out monitoring easements. But we encourage towns to then use this as an example to then make their own form. So I think this is awesome. And having something standard across all the properties is really great. So it's pretty straightforward. I recommend, again, like doing this as you're going in the field. You can, if the weather's not great, you could, I often will have like, I'll keep clean copies in the car, like blank copies, but I'll have one in the field. And so even if it gets all mucked up when I get back to the car, I can like copy, transpose anything. But yeah, as much information as you can collect while you're in the field or immediately after your visit, I highly recommend that. Just, I think it can be easy to be like, get back in the car and you go home and you're like, oh, I'll get back to that later, I'll finish it up. But it's so easy to let more time than you think go by, and then like a week later you're like, oh shoot, what did I see, what did I have a question about? So just making sure you're recording that information while you're in the field or like immediately afterwards as best you can is what I recommend. We also recommend, you'll see like, is to not leave anything blank. So you'll see like there's like yes or no. So make sure you say yes or no, or explain why it's blank, like, because that way the next person who picks this up will know, like, no, there was nothing here. You don't want to make them assume that just because it's blank, that means the answer is no. So just making sure you provide some information, even if it's just like, we didn't find anything of note, so that's clear to the next person monitoring. Yeah. Any other things about filling out the?
Yeah, just I think a couple important things, which David, if you look at David's, if you flip his over on the backside, it's the description of his route and what he saw, which is incredibly beautifully written and detailed about his route. The route is really important, as Emma said, and then you describe, there's on the backside of the template, there's space for you to do that. And then his observations. The one thing I don't know if he actually had a map that then showed that. So that's one thing we definitely want to try to do is, if there are any photos, you would mark, explain where those are, and you'd have that, printed out with your monitor report and the map. So if you were doing this property, you would have your, maybe in a yellow or purple or something. You have it up.
So I have this up here too,
Go.
sorry.
Right,
yeah.
So you'd show your route, and then you might have notes like, oh, I took a photo here, and show where you, and what that photo was of. I think the other, it's nice if you see beautiful flowers or something, but that takes up a lot of space on a monitoring report, and you might just say, oh, there was a lot of wildlife or whatever, but you don't need photos of that. It actually complicates the monitoring form. So you only want to take photos of something that seems out of place, something that might be a violation. And I guess the only other thing I would say is, you don't make judgments, you just write what you observe, right? Yeah. And then we'll talk about how we would handle any issues. But mostly David was writing about, maybe a tree was down or something, and that's totally fine. But if you think there's a violation, you don't say that here, you just write what you saw, and then there is a place to say, do you think it followed the easement or not? If you say no, then we would obviously talk about that.
Yeah.
But I think it's one thing we probably need to work on a little bit, because I don't think we've necessarily talked about easement reports after they've come back in, or if there are any issues, or do we have any follow-up? So this is part of this. Hopefully this will help us maybe standardize a little bit, and we can talk about things as they happen.
Yeah, great. You just covered the rest of the talk. That's perfect. So but I'll just show the rest of the slides. No, it's awesome. So like Ellen said, when you're out there, like making note of your route, whether I think both a written description, and that could be as simple, it looks like David went into beautiful detail, but it could be as simple as like, I walked the boundary line except in this one area. But then to make that clear, you can also like make what I call here an annotated survey map. So you're just like you can see that like purple dotted line marks the place I walked. In blue, I've noted like where I took photos and other interesting things I found, or like need better signs along this part of the boundary, things like that. So that can be super helpful, and this is the most like easy way to do this, like low tech way, and it's perfectly useful and easy to do it this way. You can also use a GPS to make a track and mark points, but not everybody is comfortable doing that, and that's totally fine. Again, like this is just as useful. So whatever works for you is fine, but it's great to include that with the map. So then somebody has not just the written description of where you went, but like a visual confirmation of where you went on the property. Photographs, so like Ellen said, she pretty much covered it, you know, really only taking photos. You can take whatever photos you want for yourself, but the photos that you're going to include with the report, often there may not be any photos included with the report, really only if you have a question, see an issue, something that may be of note as it relates to the easement itself. All right, and then, yeah, violations and your role as a conservation commissioner. And so like Ellen said, I think it's really important that it's a little complicated with towns because, you know, land trusts have professional staff that manage easement violations, and you are all volunteers. But it is the town's responsibility to do something if there is a violation on the easement. And so, but I would encourage you to think of like your role when you're monitoring as being very different as your role when you're like discussing what might be wrong with the property. So when you're out there monitoring the property, like Ellen said, you're not making judgments, you're just observing. You're just making observations and writing down like the facts of what you're seeing out there. And especially if you're with the landowner, like you don't want to say like, oh, I think that might be a violation, I'm not sure, you know, because that might be kind of a trigger for that. That could be upsetting for a landowner. And yeah, you're better, you know, in that case, you would just make a note like, oh, the landowner said they're gonna clear this 20 acres of forest next year, like note that on the form, and then bring that information back to the commission. Again, trying not to put any kind of like judgment on what they tell you or what you see when you're out there. Yeah, your role in that case is not enforcement or mediation, it's just observation. You're just a monitor. Does that make sense? And then I'm hoping to share, I talked to Barbara Richter, who's the director of the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions, and she has some document that goes into more detail about like how towns should manage violations. And I just haven't gotten it back from her yet. So hopefully I'll be able to pass it on to Ellen, you know, next week and share that with all of you. But yeah, basically you would bring that information back to the commission, you know, probably talk about it, and then bring that to town staff and then to the planning board. It depends a little bit on the town. It sounds like in Newmarket there's staff that would be relevant to.
Mark's our planner.
Oh, hi. And then having a conversation with them about how to proceed. I would also say, so just a note about violations is that the vast majority of violations are relatively minor and are resolved with a simple conversation. It's often like an innocent mistake, like dumping grass clippings over the edge of their stone wall and not realizing that that is potentially an easement violation. So you don't always want to go to like from 0 to 100 when it comes to a violation too. Like keep in mind, like what is your relationship with that landowner? What's the best approach? If you have that relationship with the landowner, maybe you work with the town planner, but maybe you're the one who has that initial conversation with the landowner, but maybe a letter in writing comes from the town or something like that. So again, like it's all about that relationship, and often the violations are completely innocent and people are happy to remedy them. And then also a lot of violations are what we call third-party violations, so they're not actually perpetrated by the landowner themselves, but by an abutter. So like a neighbor has a timber harvest and they cut over the property line, or a lot of times, for some reason, it's like they build a shed, that half of the shed is like over the property line. And so in that case, like you are actually the landowner's partner and in helping them manage that violation. So that's like, again, a great way to look at your role as a really positive thing for the landowners. You're there to help them enforce that violation and deal with it. So that's like a good role for an easement holder as well. Do you want to say anything else about?
No, just about record storage. Were you going to talk about that, or you want me to?
You should talk about that, I think, because I think every town's a little different, but yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Talk about what you would like, and then I'll add anything that comes to mind.
Great. So as Emma, I think, said at the very beginning, a key part of why we monitor is to have a track record over time, because things change over time, and you want to know what were things like 5 years ago, and what are things like, was that there 5 years ago? Oh yeah, okay, look at the baseline, yeah, that was there, kind of thing. So we want to have the monitoring reports consistently and then stored. So we have hard copies here, but we're also going to put everything on digitally in the town planner's office, so we'll have all the records. So if you're going to go monitor an easement, you could go look at, hopefully 5 years of monitoring reports if you wanted to, or just last year's, that option will be there. And the other thing is, we have some of our easements, we have to send the reports to the state. So if you pick up a field file, it will have that on that particular monitoring template. It will say the report has to go to LCHIP or to the drinking water program or the landowner, whatever the case may be. And also in the field file, on the front will be describing all the process. Like you get the field file and you do the report. I mean, it's basic stuff, but it's sometimes helpful to have like, oh yeah, okay, I gotta do that, I gotta do that, I gotta do that. So, and part of it's where do you get the field file and who do you get the report back to and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think
That's great. Yeah, I think you covered it. Yeah, a lot of towns, like, files live in somebody's living room, and like then that person retires from the commission, and it's like, oh, here's the box of files. So yeah, I think professionalizing that, file storage is something we've really been encouraging towns to do, and having things live in town hall so that anybody could step in and reference those documents going forward. So that's great. The last couple of slides are just a couple notes about safety. So if you are new to easement monitoring, I definitely recommend monitoring in pair, like with somebody else, whether that's another conservation commissioner or like bring a friend with you, just so there's two of you in the field. But at the very least, if you are going alone, make sure somebody knows where you're going to be. And like the nice thing about the field, you could literally like leave the map on your kitchen table and like let somebody know exactly where you're going to be. And bring a cell phone. That I know people hate having phones in the woods potentially, but that is a key safety item these days, and pretty helpful if you get service. Knowing hunting season, so generally, and I didn't actually mention this, but you really only want to monitor, you don't want to monitor when there's snow on the ground, and because it obscures the boundary lines and can be kind of tricky, and can obscure like other things that may have changed on the property. So you're mostly going to be monitoring from like spring through fall, but that encompasses a couple different hunting seasons. So knowing hunting seasons, wearing orange, especially because you're going to be off trail, generally speaking, if you're following the boundary line. And just a note about terrain, like if you get out there and this is what you're faced with, like you don't have to follow the boundary line, like you don't have to go the exact route you planned if it turns out that's not going to be safe. Like go around, turn around and go back. Use common sense when you're out in the field to keep yourself safe. Tick checks, check yourself every day. Probably whether or not you're monitoring. I get like more ticks in my backyard than anywhere else, but yeah, check for ticks, super important. And if you don't know what poison ivy looks like, I recommend familiarizing yourself with that plant as well. So that's it. I've got for for safety and for easement monitoring.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Any, we're gonna, once we're, if anybody has more questions for Emma, but we're gonna go through, the spreadsheet, and it's time for us to monitor these, so, see if anybody here wants to continue doing ones they're doing, or take on new ones. We don't have, some of the people who used to do them aren't here, so, and we did, get a proposal back from Southeast Land Trust to see if we want to have them monitor some of the easements, or whether we think we can have the capacity to do that. So, before we get into that though, any more questions for Emma, or any interest in any kind of follow-up assistance? We can talk about it later too, but this way how we're here.
I just had a quick comment to maybe add, or maybe you know this, but it sounds like a fuddy-duddy safety comment, but it's just so sensible. You should change your cell phone message to say, "Hi, it's Chris. I'm going to be out at the da-da-da-da-da property. I should be back around 6." So you fall down, your phone falls down a rock, and people are trying to call you. Oh, your phone died. Blah, blah. They'll have a message that says, "Where are you, and when will you maybe kind of come back?"
That's a great idea. I like that. I'll add it to my
Add it on,
safety
yeah.
notes.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks.
Yeah,
And again, like,
thank you.
I threw a fair bit of info at you, but all of it is in that training guide. And you can also download that training guide, both of those guides and some others, for free on the Nature Groupie website, which is a program of cooperative extension.
This is great.
Thank
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much.
Yeah, and you get a free sticker in there. I forgot those were in there. And again, yeah, Ellen, just let me know. I'm happy to come out and
Okay,
do.
yeah, maybe we'll see
Some
if we
in
wanna
this-
do a
whether
training
it's
sometime.
like
'Cause
in
we
the
might have
fall or
other
in the
people
spring or-
public that might wanna learn how to do some of those things.
yeah.
so.
Yeah, I'm probably actually due to do like a map and compass workshop anyway.
Okay.
It's been a while, so,
Let's do it in this area.
yeah,
Good plan. Great, thank you.
thanks,
Thank you.
thanks.
All right, so let's, we got some other stuff on the agenda, so let's, if you can pull up your nice giant, thank you, Bart, for these nice giant spreadsheets. So let's go through, so Bald Hill Reservation is the newer easement, the Southeast Land Trust owns the property at the top of Hayden Place. And we've never monitored that, partly because it's actually one of the, pretty simple, it's actually a conservation, they call it conservation restrictions, but it is a deed, deed restriction, conservation deed restrictions and we hold that deed restriction. So it seems like a good idea if we, start monitoring that property. Maybe I'll just go down through the list and then we can sort of go back and see if people want to do those. Hilton is already managed by the Southeast Land Trust, so we'll continue having them do that one. The Smith Sisters we just talked about, and I assume David will want to keep monitoring that. He's been doing a great job, and I will talk with him about using the field file and the template if he's up for that. Nostrum Farm, I don't know, different people have monitored that. I know Patrick did it, I think, the last few years. It's kind of a complicated one, too. Maybe as complicated as Smith Sisters, just because it's a farm and there's some exclusion areas and so forth.
Where is that on the map?
So that is out in the far northwest corner of Newmarket. So you see the Clark Farm,
Oh, there it is, yeah.
which we hold the executory interest on, and the Nostrum Farm is next to it. So there's that one. Piscasset Greenway Gaziano Tract is the new piece that CELT owns, and we hold the easement. That will be a relatively easy one to monitor because it's CELT and it's kind of like Audubon, but it's a much easier boundary. And then Schneer is, sorry, I should point, so you know where the Gaziano piece is, probably familiar with that out Neal Mill Road. Schneer is the little piece just to the north, and then Silverman is where Joff Barnett owns those pieces now. I've been doing Silverman Schneer, and could add Gaziano, or we could have two of us do it together. That would be nice, because it's nice, as Emma said, to have a couple people do them together. Yeah, so I forget what I was going to say there, but, so yeah, so we have, and then we are required to monitor currently the Piscasset Glazelle, which, Sam, you've been doing that one, because even though it's our own property, we have to send a report to LCHIP. Yeah, so those are the things we thoughts or,
So we are doing Piscasset Glazelle again this year?
well, so the proposal
don't.
from, if we could sort of talk about it parallel, so they submitted the proposal, which was in your packet. They do Hilton, it's about $300 a year, and it looks like if we had them do Nostrum and Piscasset-Glazell, it'd be about another 300, I think probably up to $1,000. If we wanted them to do those two. I think I mentioned the last meeting, even though, Sam's been doing a great job, we own the property, and you typically don't want to monitor your own property. So it seems like it'd be nice to have a third party do that, but it's not essential, just a possibility. If we wanted Celt to do it, we don't have, currently the Hilton expense comes out of the general fund, because we have that under contract, under that line item. And as you recall, we've requested for FY '24 up to $1,000 if we decided we wanted to go for this. So for FY '23, they can monitor it this year for us, but we'd have to take that money out of the conservation fund, which we have obviously funds in there. So there's a couple pieces with that proposal. I think it's mainly, do we feel we have the capacity? If there are people here that want to do this, or do we want to farm it out? We have a lot of other responsibilities in terms of the fee ownerships, which we're going to talk about next meeting. So that was my sort of impetus. I know people here have the skills to do it. I just want to make sure we have the capacity, given all the other projects we have on the current plate and perhaps on the horizon.
I don't know, I think that we should take every opportunity to conserve our funds wherever we can. So if we have, I've never done this,
Mm-hmm.
so I'd love to,
Okay.
yeah, learn and take on a property or
Okay.
something.
Right, I don't think besides the ones I've done and Sam here who's done Piscasset-Glazell, and I assume David will do Smith Sisters. Bald Hill Reservation is a new one, and Ostrom Farm needs a monitor. And yeah,
Yeah.
and then those other three.
All right.
Do you want to do, how do you feel about doing?
I'll do it again. I mean, especially if we're not gonna have money until the FY '24 budget
Yeah.
for it. And maybe
can
it makes
debate.
sense to do it one more year
Okay.
and then
We can
revisit
decide.
it
Okay.
next year.
Okay. Cool.
Are there properties like Tuttle Swamp, is that doable? Like, can
So-
we get out there, or is it really swampy?
It's swampy. So the orange properties are
That's
properties
true.
we own.
Right,
So we don't.
but does anybody monitor that? Like, are people,
No. So we're going to talk about that, I think, next meeting, because we should be spending a little bit more time on the properties we actually own as well.
Yeah.
And that's my point that I think it's great if we want to monitor, but we got a lot of work to do. So as
Yeah.
long as people are okay with doing it, it's great. So we need someone to monitor Nostrum. Unless we could have Celt just add one, or we can have them,
Yeah.
we have to find somebody to monitor that one.
well, I don't mind
You want to do that one too?
assigning that.
Okay.
Nostrum's
Nostrum?
it's pretty tough.
It's
Oh, is
a
it?
I've done
complicated-
that. I've done one a couple of times many
It's
years
pretty,
ago. But
it's pretty complicated, because it's a farm and, yeah,
Because if you want to get into the use of the different portions and say,
Yeah.
oh, they're not using that right, and they're,
Yeah.
that's
yeah,
That's the hard part.
the issue is interpretation and, yeah, it's complicated. So
Yeah.
at the very least, we might need outside guidance on that sort of thing. So we might have to go to Celt
Anyway,
at some point, but
Yeah.
it's up to you if you're willing to
sure.
try it.
I'm willing to go. I mean,
Yeah,
if you
if you
need
wanna do it
anyone to go out and
together.
help on most of these, I'm more than willing to
Yeah,
to
let's
help
do it.
out.
All right, anybody else?
Bald Hill doesn't look too.
What's that?
Bald Hill doesn't look too difficult. I
Yeah,
mean,
did you say you wanted to do Bald Hill? Or you wanted to do just Nostrum?
I was just
Okay.
speaking up about
You wanna
Nostrum, but
do
I'm
try
happy to do
Baldwin?
anything.
Yeah, I was also gonna say I could help with the.
Or you want to join me
Yeah,
with
you'll
those
know
three
as
since
well,
you're
'cause
nearby?
I live,
Okay.
yeah.
Why don't you and I do all those three, because
Yeah, I'd
basically you
love
do them
to.
in one day.
Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward.
But I can also try Bald Hill, it's pretty small.
It's pretty small and it's Celt, and they haven't really done much up there yet, so it
But
might be
that's a-
hard to find the boundaries.
That's what I was about to say. The boundaries of the Bald Hill one might be a little difficult
Yeah.
because there's not, Because it's some of it, a lot of it's interior to the parcel, so there's not like stone walls around the whole thing. You're
Did
in
you
backyard.
survey that? Did you guys survey that one?
We did survey that, yeah.
Would you be interested in helping her the
Yeah.
first time out there?
Sure.
Okay, cool. That'd be great. All right, let me make a note here. This is great. So, David, so, yeah, right. David, I think we're gonna, yeah, he'll do, I'm sure he'll do some sisters, so, great, okay, so we'll just have, Melissa's gonna do Nostrum. Yeah, he could help her, he's also gonna help with Bald Hill.
Yeah, my dog, yeah.
So before everybody leaves tonight, at the end of the meeting, I have field files for each of the properties, so you'll get those. And I've got some conservation easement signs, because you might need extras. And I've got some nails, but we might need to buy more nails, and we probably should get flagging for people. So we might need to approve some expenditures, but I've got some others as well, so we can hold that thought.
So is Bald Hill marked with cell markers, right?
Yeah, so that's a good thing. So what I like to do is if we're putting our own, because we've never put them up there, we've never monitored it. So what I like to do, I don't know if you haven't thought about this, is to put if the property owner, like Salt or Audubon, already has signs, which they typically do, is to put our sign on the same tree. Because then it's like, okay, Audubon owns it, and then we hold the easement. Otherwise, you get kind of kittywampus on the signage. Or you get just too many signs, right, all over the place. So if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Great. Great, well, that was pretty simple. Any other,
Then so scheduling these out, like
Yeah, I
at our
mean,
next meeting, or?
yeah, sort of get them done. We want to get them done before the end of the year, before snow, so usually October, November. We had talked about buying like orange vests for commission members, but do people have their own orange vests pretty much? Yeah, because we're all out in the fall, so.
Yeah.
But we might want to buy flagging
I have,
and nails. Do you have flagging?
if I donated 1 box of flagging.
Hey,
I think
that sounds great.
That 10 rolls of flagging should last quite some time.
Okay.
12 rolls?
So I can give,
I think I can convince
I can
people.
give people nails. So what we typically use are galvanized aluminum nails. So if a chainsaw hits a tree, eventually someday it won't break the chainsaw because the nails will break. They're very soft-headed too, which can be good and bad. So when you put, and you may all have done this, but so when you nail into the tree, definitely only go in 1 inch, and sometimes you can go in less if it's really hard, so that you have a lot of room for the tree to grow. So we put one here, one here. So you carry your hammer, your signs, your nails, all your paperwork. Good. But I can give some people some extra nails and stuff today. Okay, are we pretty cool on easements? Great. So in terms of process though, so I'm gonna give you the field files. If you can do your monitoring, you can do a hard copy or you can do a digital copy. It's up to you. Like you can want to do it all digitally or do it hand and then scan it and then send me the PDF. I do want it as a PDF eventually, so if you want to give me the hard copy, we can scan it. It's whatever you want to do, but you should have a map, and again, if there are photos, and monitoring report. And then we'll take care of, either Bart or I will take care of sending it to the third party if that's required. That sound like a deal, so you just have to get the reports.
I was going to point this out, that this map is not the correct one. The boundary is incorrect.
That's an old, so that's not the recorded one,
No, it's not even like a,
the right composite?
it's not even the 3 sheets of the recorded version. But I can look and see what we've.
I have the 3 recorded sheets, I just,
Do you, if
I was
if
hoping
you-
that was a composite, but
It is probably just before they finalize the area
Oh.
around the house.
could
'Cause
you create a composite for it?
That's what I wrote myself a note to get a new overall map to you guys for the.
That'd be great.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
then the other thing I was going to point out is I think this is incorrect.
The,
Smith Sisters location.
you mean where it is?
Yeah. It's that green shape
Oh,
further to the west.
That extra part, right.
Yeah, this is, I believe that's Autobahn. the Autobahn property, that the old Quox driving range.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Right, right,
This-
right.
This is what.
That's-
You are right. Thank you for that correction.
The old Quox driving range.
Yeah, yeah, totally wrong spot, exactly.
That was where I said the kiosk is just completely
Yeah.
Yeah.
overgrown, and it's getting worse, because like,
Yeah.
that much left on top.
All right, great, thanks for that correction, so we'll get you a new map at some point. Very good. Good, thank you for that. And, all right, so we're gonna get flagging from, and a new one sheet of assessors. Okay, but everybody else should be good to go on there. Excellent. All right, back to our agenda, if I can find it. Hi, Sue, welcome to our meeting. I know you came in.
Yeah.
So Colin wasn't able to make it. I'm not sure where David is, so I'll have to check in with him. We had no public comment. We didn't do the minutes yet since you weren't here, so let's do the minutes next. I just had one correction on the first page under land stewardship. The last, second to the last lines there, the second to last line, it says 7 conservation easements and the 3 town-owned lands. That actually was 3 town-held executory interests. We actually have 4, which Jeff corrected us at the meeting, so that's actually now on the map. The dogs was an
So-
executory interest, so.
You'd like me to change
No, it should say 3, because that's what we said, but
Okay.
that's fine.
There was another change to page 2, line 29, I think it's our last name.
All right. All right, motion to accept the minutes. Any other corrections? Motion to accept the minutes as amended.
Second?
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
I'll
Abstentions?
abstain. I'll abstain
Chris
because I was
abstained.
absent.
All right. All right, we've got a couple more issues we add to the agenda, but first let's talk a little bit about Sliding Rock Conservation Area. If you know where that is, or if you don't know, we have our map here. Down by, Twin River, people know where the Twin Rivers is, down by Elm Street, and then you go down, down to the river. And we have a little park there.
It's the northernmost part on this map.
Yeah, very good. And so we have a park, and there's a boat launch, and there's a kiosk, and very popular apparently for boating and swimming and so forth, and there's a little trail in the woods. So Patrick Reynolds alerted us to the people, there is a, rec department has a rack for 6 kayaks, canoes that you can, or kayaks you can rent. But then there's about 8 to 10 other boats there, some of which are chained to trees. And so Patrick and Amy from rec director and I went down this week to look at it, and we had a couple thoughts. One is the season is starting to end, so rather than sort of, obviously that's not allowed. We're not allowed to store boats there. But again, we don't really have great signage, but obviously you can't chain a boat to a tree. So we thought about, well, should we put signs on the canoes or kayaks and tell people to get them, or the season's about to end, so figure out a solution. Patrick is on LRAC, the Lamprey River Advisory Committee, and they have those community grants, one of which we got for Heron Point this year, and so we can apply to them. Amy is interested in maybe getting another rack that she would advertise as a rental space, so people could put their kayak or canoe on that and pay a rental fee if they want to keep their boat there.
Yeah.
So that's one option for the boats, and then we would put better signage to say, you can't change your boats. You can't leave your boats here. They have to be on a rack.
Yeah.
So
So the-
that's,
LRAC funds would pay for the rack?
they pay for the racks. They pay
And
for
then
all the.
we'd rent the space?
That's what she's done with all the other ones too. Well, not all of them. but
We bought the racks, though, or she bought the racks, didn't
She got some. I think she bought some of them from LRAC money. That's what she
It's
said.
LRAC money,
Really?
yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And some of them are ones that are rented, and some, I think she rents space on some of them.
She rents
One-
space on those.
Yeah. The money then goes to the back to the rec department.
I should know by heart how much it is, but I'm comfortable saying it's extremely nominal. This is not Gloucester Yacht Club kind of.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
I think it's as luxurious personally, but it's,
Yeah.
I think it's 2 digits.
So
No
that's,
comment.
so that's one piece of it. They're also, when you go down there, just, if you're standing, looking at the water on the boat, and if you look to the right where basically where the conservation area is, there's about 6 hazard trees, completely dead trees, that are fairly tall, and a few more at the point. So we could include that in the grant to LRAC, because they paid for that at Heron Point, and they would pay for, presumably pay for, so this is like a, several ideas to package together to submit to LRAC for a grant. And then we talked about where people have their boats, they sort of just drag them over. There's a little slope and down the sandy area, and it's eroding a bit. And we talked a little bit about, well, maybe we should apply for a better boat launch, but then I'm thinking it's kind of complicated and expensive, and it seems like a little bit too much right now. So I would propose that we not do anything right now about that.
That's a town-owned launch.
Yeah, it's part of the,
I didn't know if the fishing game had any funds
No, I
in
don't
the ramp itself.
I don't think so. I think the Conservation Commission years ago got money to actually improve the boat launch, but I think the commission did that on its own.
I know it's a little, I use that occasionally, a few times a year, and I was down there I don't know, 3 weeks ago. I think I personally feel like the low end of it, people pull their trailers out and the water rushes over that bottom end. It's like completely eroded between the concrete pieces.
Yeah.
And I know it's a bit dicey. I've seen some people walking
Yeah.
around there. It's like kids run down there. It's like fall down or.
Yeah, it seems like kind of an old style launch material.
Yeah.
I don't know. The newer ones I don't think are made quite that way, but, so maybe if somebody ever wants to take that as a project, but that's like a bigger project to look at the whole boat launch for trailers as well as individual boats, but I'm not prepared to take that project on at the moment.
It's pretty heavily used.
It's very heavily used, so
Yeah.
at some point, we might need to have a look at that, but. So we have the hazard trees, we have the, maybe 1 or 2 kayaks, and if we don't think we should charge, it could just be, they could be there, and people, if there's space, people can put their boat there, whether we charge or not, but that's maybe a conversation for.
I would have that
Amy.
conversation with Amy, because there is a cost, administrative fee, which it sounds like a catch-all word, but somebody who has to trailer the thing out, trailer it back at the end of the season, and prepare it for safe storage, and then get it back in a certain amount of time. So the fees of renting the slips really go toward that type of care of the things.
Yeah, but like we can talk, or if we decide we want to apply for this, we can, I can talk to Amy about that. And then the third piece, I thought, if you look at, there's a kiosk there, it's a little bit different shape, it's like a bit sharp, it's like a square. But it's got the old watershed map that used to be the same one that used to be at Heron Point, and I thought, well, we did the Heron Point panels, why not ask for the money to update the panel there?
Oh,
Which
yeah.
is something we could do. So, I'd be happy to put throw some numbers together. It's a pretty simple application, like we did with Heron Point, and talk with Amy about what she would like to do as part of it, and we just submit it as an application. What do you think?
That'd be handsome, that'd be lovely, because it is heavily
Good idea.
used.
So basically just consensus that we should apply for
Yeah.
some money. Does that sound good? Okay. We can work on that.
And I think we are sort of slowly working toward consistency across all the properties
Yeah.
as well, so,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I don't think we have a sign there, so I can't remember if I saw a sign. It's on the, I can't remember if it's on the kiosk.
An entry sign,
An entry
I'm gonna
sign.
say similar to the Piscasset Guazella one,
Yeah.
but it's kind of one I would do
Yeah.
something with. But anyway, we need a sign there that could match or be
Right.
in the flavor of
Yeah.
Piscasset.
So we should include that too in the only thing I know in the past, the Conservation Commission did a bunch of stuff down there years ago internally on the trail, and there was a ton of vandalism. So you see this big vandalism sign, which is a little intense, but apparently there was a lot at that time. But whether that's still there, whether we still need those signs, and certainly we don't want to put any structure interior, because it's pretty secluded in there. People can do it, but the things we're proposing, I think, are really visible and hopefully wouldn't.
I think there was a gazebo in there. Somebody burned it.
Yeah, they
right?
burned it. Yeah, that was.
Well, I would think the poison ivy would keep vandals
Yeah.
out after the first.
I was thinking multiple rows and things like that around.
It's just a beautiful
So,
ground cover, and it's,
okay.
well, that is all poison. Super healthy.
But once we get the cost for that one for Lozelle, if you could let me know what that cost is, we could include that as a, so an entrance sign, a
Yes.
kiosk, and then
Yeah,
these other things.
thank you for that, by the way.
Sure, yeah,
For
yeah,
Shop
no
Meier.
worries. Took me a few to get it to.
All right,
Couldn't do it from my phone, I had to use a computer, so it took me a while again.
all right.
That's all right.
All right, let's talk, okay, if we're good on that, Chris, let's talk about the October 15th, so for the beginning, Sue, for your benefit, I asked for 2 additional items on the agenda. One is to talk a little bit more about the October 15th event, and we have a request to use Heron Point Sanctuary for a wedding, a fairly low-key wedding, but, so we're gonna talk about. So we'll talk about that, see if we think it'd be okay. So Chris, you wanna talk a little bit more about?
I
October
do. I was
15th?
just gonna get a couple of sentences here that I screenshot from one of the presenters to make sure I get it right. So, I'll be working or getting a hold of you, Melissa, so you can start some more, do a full court press on some social media stuff
Yep.
for it. We have this auditorium of Town Hall reserved, so that's where we can stage information about the volunteer projects, which Ellen can bring us up to date on. But we have 3 speakers, shorter than last year, and we are competing with a couple of other really interesting events, and I don't think I'll give them airtime on this meeting, but there are 2 great organizations with great events. But anyway, we have Birdwatch presentation, because it was so popular last time, and his bird watching group has taken off, and they meet, oh golly, a few times in the fall migration season, and then a few times in the spring migration season. So that seems to be a thing. We have this one I'm really excited about, because I was at a town council meeting for something else, and this person spoke, and I felt like a really naughty 8th grade kid, because I wrote a note and turned it and passed it to her when she sat back down and stuff. It's Kelsey Meyer. And this is the wrong screenshot. She's a PhD candidate right now at UNH, and her specialty, her research project is invasive species in the Great Bay. So I was really impressed, thinking that we were going to be able to give somebody a new audience to talk to about their passion being this research about the invasive species. And I was just really impressed hearing her, as a member of the public, speak to the town council. So I just took it upon myself to say, are you available? Would you do this? She works with Gabby Brandt about the green crabs and whatnot. So anyway, she's agreed, and she's really happy to do it. She lives right here in Newmarket, so it felt great to bring somebody into the fold with that kind of passion and background. And then bringing Pollinator Pathways back quickly with their display and information, because they're gaining traction with more people putting their signs in their lawns. And it's tough sometimes from our side of the fence here, saying like, pollinators, like, are we not sick of the bees yet? But, the more people we reach, and it takes a few times to learn these things and kind of try them on for size and see what your neighbor's doing. So I think it's thrilling to have them come back with a presentation and their displays of stuff, and maybe sell a few signs for people that want to plant their signs in their lawn. So those are boom, boom, boom. And then we need to advertise that we have volunteer projects, which Ellen is coordinating for Piscassic Loiselle. And then we also have from the rec the chance to use the van again for people that wanted to get taken to the volunteer site, because parking there is precious few and far between. I don't know how many volunteers, but even if you had 10, similar to a group size that you had last year, that parking could get really chomped up really quickly, I think. Anyway, we have a van for that. If we needed, we could have 2 vans, because we could do a tour again. And Ellen had quickly brainstormed some ideas about people stationed at one of the conservation sites to be able to keep promoting. Come see this, hear this, come try this, visit this site. So that's where we're at. What I don't know is the terminus time, because I don't know how long to advertise the volunteer projects would last. But I'm thinking the 3 presentations are in the order of 8:45. Welcome. I know earlier is nicer for many people, but a Saturday morning, I think 8:45 is a believable start time, with welcome, hello, and then presentation, huddle, pollinator pathway information, huddle, volunteers, there you go, and people on the tours, there you go. It can also be self-guided tours, as long as we advertise them maybe a bit more thoroughly than last year. And what we learned last year was have people have each other's cell phone numbers. So we can say, here the van is coming, or here the van is so late, or it's too hot and people don't want to get out there anymore. So communicating like that would be essential, I think. But I think it shapes up to be another, building on last year, and I probably had 6 people say, are you doing it again? Are you doing it again? So that's not insignificant, so I think it feels good and comfortable, and I'm glad it's here, although we don't need the overhead. A couple of the presenters ended up being wooed away by something else that's going on that day, which I understand. But I think it's comfortable to park here and meet here and be here. What I don't know is last time we were really lucky and had freshly baked stuff as a treat, and we had a member who is very supportive of us, but not a member anymore, who had the Starbucks connection. So do we want to think about a box of Joe or 2, or do we want to leave that by the by? I don't know.
Do you know did people partake of it last year?
They did. Last year was a dinky bit goofy. The food part was goofy, but we were still kind of like, COVID, not COVID. Did you touch it? Where did it come from? I don't remember who, but somebody had the genius idea. There was fresh nuts in small portions. That was you. That was lovely. That was popular.
That was the last minute before I ran out the door. I was like, that would
Well,
be
it was
cool.
genius, and that felt old school safe. I would think people would partake just because we're far enough away from that, and this is before flu. I think we have a nice window for that kind of hospitality flavor personally. But maybe that's just because I've come from UNH Sea Grant this morning, and you don't go to one of their things without a Betty Crocker bake-off. So I would think it's a nice thing to offer.
So, we'll come back to that, but, so if we were thinking of a little bit of volunteer work day at
Yep.
Piscasquale's, we
Yep.
have the Bluebird
For the
box.
bluebird boxes.
Those came
and
out
the-
last year
and
with a
the
couple
bridge.
of volunteers.
Yeah, the bridge, so I was thinking about, we want to put, we need a couple signposts, which we talked about, I think, last meeting on the trail, right? A couple signposts, so you need to get the posts out there, you gotta dig the holes, you gotta fill them in, put the posts up, make them level. So if we put 2, that's a bit of volunteer time. The bridge is a little more complicated,
Yeah.
unless we have somebody who wants to spearhead that,
I
building
think
that
that's,
bridge.
that's sort of beyond
I think it
this
might be beyond,
event.
so that might be a
That's its own project.
own project. But, we could put up like, augment the trail signs on the trees
Yep.
and brush out the trail, and so.
We could talk it up as a possible separate volunteer
Yep.
thing, and,
Yep.
if you like this property, or if you wanna participate,
We can
This is
bring in a
what's going
scout
on.
who needs an
Yeah.
Eagle project.
there you go.
A success of last year that we heard a lot of feedback about was that the volunteer project was I use the phrase quick, easy, down and dirty. It wasn't, but it was, you could go and have the success of you started it, you saw the project, and you finished it. So many volunteer projects are, you contribute your part, and then it snowballs and somebody else gets the terminus. But the success I think we have is, here's the mess, or here's the problem, and you guys all fix it up.
Mhm.
That's a really good feeling, and I think that's a good use of a day like that.
Yeah, so I think we're good for Piscasquale's Hill.
Is that, Sac-Crete goes in the hole that holds the pillars, the posts up? You
So-
say you dig the hole, you put the
Oh,
post
yeah,
up.
we don't, I don't typically use, we just fill them back in.
Oh, you just fill them back in,
As
okay.
long as, it's a possibility that it could be a problem out there, because it's very rocky. What do you think, Sam? It's pretty rocky.
It's pretty rocky.
So we might have to think about that, but we could,
Pour around the
we could
rocks
get a
is what I was
wheelbarrow, and
wondering.
people would have to help us wheelbarrow that out.
Nice.
So I don't know what time we.
I think the field is I think we dug some new holes around the parking area, and those weren't too
I
bad.
Yeah.
know, but this is out in
Where-
out in the trail.
With
Oh,
your
you
game
put
trail
posts out,
junctures?
Yeah,
posts
oh,
out
yeah,
in the
yeah,
trail?
that's right.
The trail junctures.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's
that'd be
pretty
tough.
rocky in
For
there.
having the trail
It's a touch
sign.
rocky, yeah.
Yeah,
That's the gateway to those big, beautiful boulders.
that's why you have
Yeah.
volunteers, so they can help
God,
dig the
I
holes.
love that.
So anyway, so that we might need a little bit of, would need a little bit of funds for that to buy the posts and stuff like that, and the signs.
Would we use some of the funds that we got graciously from the leftover Heron Fund fundraising?
Yeah, I
or
mean, they're in
something?
our conservation
We have
fund,
the
so,
money,
yeah.
anyway,
yeah,
okay.
So that'd be a good use. So last year we went to 4 properties, but it depends on whether there's people that wanna host
Right.
other properties.
Well, you guys will be at one, and I
Yeah.
don't know if that counts or how the logistics are for that. I would be happy to be at any one you wanted me at.
I don't know if you wanna do like Heron Point, because hopefully the kiosk panels are gonna be done soon.
Yeah.
So those will be up, so it might be just, hey. here's
Yeah,
our
here we are,
grand opening of-
365 days later,
Yeah.
check this out.
So that might be
Yeah, I could do
helpful.
that easily
Yeah, okay.
and happily.
Yeah. Sam, this was an idea, I thought if you were available or interested, if Shanda Park, and then we could You could talk about.
I would be.
Are you away?
I will unfortunately be in Ohio on October 15th, so not here.
So we could just do, the map and people can find their way around.
Yeah,
the properties.
self-guided thing.
Yeah.
Maybe we can still keep the van used to get people to Heron Point, because there again, parking is
Yeah.
a dinky bit goofy.
Yeah. And of course, that's a hotel because it's a small parking area.
Yeah.
Um,
All right, so let's do that.
Are they
That's-
building parking or is it just a presentation?
It's a presentation. You had mentioned being interested in birds. October 15th, could have some nice migration stuff going
Yeah,
on.
I was thinking if I was hanging out out in, Skasek there off the mill, if people want to come and learn about what's on the boardwalk or just out in that area, in the field or.
That'd be a great choice. I mean, that would
We could,
fall
we
into.
did. It's always a beautiful place.
It's always a beautiful place.
Yeah.
October 15th, I mean,
Yeah.
Or another place too, but I'm very familiar with what I've been seeing there.
yeah, and
regularly,
it's
so
still
it
on the
makes it
flight
easy.
plan of people thinking, oh, it's still quote unquote new. I don't know how long it's gonna be considered new trail, but
There was
is
quite a
still
bit of interest in that property last year because
there
of how
was.
new it was and
Yeah.
all that. I bet you,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
write up a couple little sentences about the what and the why, like great time of year to see the living-ins, a couple of
Yeah.
examples of what might be
Yeah,
there.
when I was in Vermont, I led beginner bird walks for like 3 years straight, so. I've
Wonderful.
got a lot of-
Did you finally get to intermediate level, or did you?
No, because the interest was beginners. I had 40 people show up for one walk, which then I was like calling friends, like, can you come also lead this
Right,
walk
can you
with
boost
me?"
this for me?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I can't get 40 people on a bird.
Right.
So,
So
yeah.
that's perfect then. If we had Neal Mill and Heron Point and Piscasset
Yeah.
and Ohio. Now, there is a lovely bird sanctuary in Ohio.
Yeah,
I've seen the
people want to
t-shirts.
come to Ohio, they can hang out with me. But
And would that kind of be like a time you could find me there, maybe after the presentations? Like, I'm
Yeah.
guessing the volunteer will be.
like a 2-hour
Yeah.
window or
So
something,
come
yeah.
here though that morning.
Yes.
Because this is Juliana,
Yes.
and you can say,
Totally fine.
yeah.
Yeah.
Now, what I don't know is can we have Tim set up, I don't know his exact schedule, I know he's full-time now, but could he set up the recording things and just tell us what buttons to push for that morning?
I don't know, you want to ask him, check?
To
Yeah.
record the presentations and
Yeah.
stuff.
I don't know if that's a cost or who pays for that.